In November of last year, I attended a symposium on democracy and journalism. It was hosted by a young man named Nick Troiano of Unite America. Joining Nick on the stage were two journalists. One was Jessica Yellen, a former White House correspondent for CNN in Washington, D.C. The other was a young man named Isaac Saul of Tangle News, who had a quiet confidence about him that intrigued me immediately. To be brief, this panel discussion was about the future of digital journalism and its importance in a representative democracy. As you will hear during the podcast, Isaac is not only an accomplished journalist, he is also, much to his own surprise, a rising star and entrepreneur in the realm of independent journalism. Isaac began his career at the University of Pittsburgh as a sports reporter for his college newspaper, and his first professional gig was at the Huffington Post in 2013, before being asked to work side by side with Ashton Kutcher in his media startup A+, where he served as a reporter and editor for over 6 years. He started Tangle in 2021. I hope you enjoyed this young man as much as I did. He's a powerful example of what journalism can be and what it should be. Well, Isaac Saul, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So we met a couple weeks ago at it's called The Summit, which is a conference in Palm Desert. And I watched you up on stage with Jessica Yellen from CNN and Nick Troiano from Unite America. And it was a journalism and democracy symposium, specifically discussing the macro of what's happening to both our journalism and our democracy. And I was obviously very impressed with you and your comments and oratory skills. But I think even more so, I was impressed with what you've built, specifically Tangled News. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And that's kind of when I came up to the stage and said, hey, I think you're an impressive young man. I'd love to have you on my show, because we at True 30 are doing similar things. You know, we interview people. We're into slow journalism. We have no breaking news. We have none of the stuff that, broadcast news does. But our similarities are that we are attempting to understand without agreement. That's what our platform is all about. You talk about educating the other side to both points of view, and Tangled News itself, as a platform, is attempting to do just that. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your unique approach at Tangled News, and then we can get into kind of the origins of where you came from as a journalist and all that. But tell us a little bit about Tangled News.
Yeah, for sure. So I launched Tangle a little over 3 years ago now. And initially, it was a concept that I had basically written down in my notebook, which I thought was a really nice resolution to, in my mind, the tension that we see in the mainstream media right now, which is that people go get news to affirm their priors, basically. So if you're a conservative and you watch Fox News, it'll make you mad sometimes, for sure, and it'll get you riled up. But for the most part, you're going to hear a lot of stuff that you basically already believe. You're going to run into a lot of commentary you already believe. And the same is true of CNN and MSNBC if you're on the left. And I recognized, I think, early on that this was a huge problem, back in 2013, 2014, when the Facebook bubble and the news bubble was sort of just starting to be acknowledged. And so I've seen a lot of people try and solve this problem, some just by saying we're nonpartisan and then not being nonpartisan at all. Others by, pulling together journalists who are from across the political spectrum and then having sort of like inter-work conflict and a lot of, I think, content they're putting out that sort of just like doesn't line up, doesn't match, doesn't mix well. And my idea was really simple. I'm just going to tell you the basics of the story in the most neutral language possible. What's happening? What's this debate? What's this political issue that we have? And then I'm going to give you 3 opinions from the left and 3 opinions from the right and my take. And every newsletter, that's exactly what we do. You read the newsletter from top to bottom, you're going to run into basically 7 opinion pieces, little mini excerpts of editorials. One of them is from me, and the other 6 are from conservatives and liberals we're finding across the country. And then you're going to get a little neutral breakdown of just like a kind of explanatory piece about, what is this story? What are the basic facts? Turns out people really like that. I was not sure what was going to happen when we started this. I was not sure what the appetite was going to be like for this, because if you have any kind of political inclinations and you read Tangle, you're going to run into a bunch of views that you don't like. You're going to see things in there that, make you uncomfortable, maybe piss you off a little bit. But hopefully you're also going to see some perspectives that you relate to, that kind of represent your worldview, your perspective. And if I'm not doing that, then like we're failing. So the idea is that we present a diverse enough number of views across the political spectrum that, 95% of Americans or politically involved people who are watching what's happening in America, we have a lot of international readers, will read our newsletter and they'll see a little bit of themselves and they'll see a lot of the rest of the country and other people that they might not agree with. And we're trying to get people out of the news bubble. I mean, that's the number one goal. Is I believe that most Americans are not engaging with views and perspectives that challenge their currently held beliefs. And the goal of Tangle is to do that, is to get people thinking more critically about what they believe, why they believe it, and also maybe, hopefully grow a little empathy along the way for some folks who they don't necessarily see eye to eye with.
Well, that's awesome. And do you actually take, because I subscribed after we met in the desert, but do you actually take pieces and parts, you have sources on your own, correct? That are separate of like Fox or CNN or any of the aforementioned broadcast networks. Do you take any of those sources, or where do the actual pieces come from? So 3 pieces on the left, 3 pieces on the right. Give me an example of what those look like.
Yeah, great question. So I have a library, I would say, of about 140 to 150 digital and print publications that I am just constantly reading, basically. And then tons of podcasts that I listen to. And then, I'll check in and watch, usually not live, but after the fact, what did the primetime hosts on Fox News and CNN and MSNBC talk about the night before? Or if I'm covering an issue I think they may have covered, I'll go look in their archives and see, did Tucker do a bit on the Respect for Marriage Act? And if he did, what did he say about it? So we take people from across different platforms. Sometimes YouTubers even show up, podcast hosts. Majority of it are opinion writers. There are people who are writing opinion pieces that are getting published in various publications, traditional, new, heterodox, Substack newsletters. I mean, everything. So a huge portion of my job and the people, I have some interns and some part-time employees, is we are just like scouring the world for pieces. We know what the topic is. We have a few days of lead time going into that topic. And we're spending that time just consuming as much content as we can from as many diverse voices as possible. And then we try and pick, 6 pieces that we think sort of speak to each other, but also represent really strong arguments that might move the needle for somebody if they don't agree with that person, and also are kind of representative of what we think is, a specific view. So we have no rules about this, but generally, I try and represent what I sort of see in America as like the 4 kind of divisions that we have, which is like the progressive left, the more establishment Democratic Party, and then sort of the Trumpist right, and the more, establishment old GOP, Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney, et cetera. You should get all 4 of those people, all 4 of those groups, some flavors from them in every edition of the newsletter that we publish.
Yeah, I that's what I really appreciated about that, because I've done the same thing with True 30 in that we talk about liberals and progressives being separate. So it's on the right, there you have the difference between a Trump person and a small c conservative, right? So it is those 4 factions. And I don't know if you mentioned Heterodox as far as Heterodox Academy, because Jonathan Haidt, I'm a member of that as well. And so I get a lot of information when I'm reporting on things for the same thing, because I actually want to get the diversity of viewpoint. And that's something he obviously talks about at length with Heterodox Academy and what they're trying to do there. But I think that's a really cool reason that I like your writing. And you're a young man, so you've been in it for 10 plus years, I think. And my homework, you started out at University of Pittsburgh as a sports reporter, correct?
Yeah,
was your
that's
first
right.
gig.
My
and
first
then
gig, yeah.
Out of college, I think you went to HuffPo. Was that your first big publisher?
Yeah, Huffington Post was the first big publication that I worked at. And I was actually lived in Israel for about 6 months between graduation and HuffPost. So I was traveling and writing a bit in the Middle East and sending cover letters and pieces I was writing to all different news outlets, pitching stuff as a freelance reporter, writing cover letters, applying for jobs. And, I always tell people, I mean, my experience at Huffington Post was sort of like one of the first genesis moments of Tangle for me, because not just what I experienced in the newsroom there, but going there and realizing that just by virtue of working there, I was immediately pegged as, being a bleeding heart lib from the start, from the very first moment of my career. Of course, because it's a very left-leaning,
very liberal outlet. Yeah. And
even more so now than it was back then. I mean, I think they step a little bit to the left every year. But the reality for me was I was a kid with an English degree who majored in journalism, and I applied to 50, 40 different newsrooms, and Huffington Post was the one place that gave me a job. So I took it.
Done. Yeah.
Yeah. They're going to pay me to do what I want. And I think I was, living at my mom's house in Philly, making $38,000 a year, taking a 2-hour train in New York City every day. It was not like the job I would have chosen if I had the pick of the lot, but it was a good experience in terms of, getting to understand what it meant to be in a real newsroom with deadlines and editors and all that stuff. And also experiencing like the forces of being in a place where there's a clear ideological tilt to the news that's going out, and like how that works and how that sausage is made too, which, I think a lot of reporters experience all over the country.
I think even more so now. What year were you at HuffPo?
I was there in 2014. So I would have started very late 2013 and then through 2014. Yeah.
So this was after Tim Armstrong bought it and changed it even more so. So yeah, because I come from the ad business. And so I had a lot of buddies at HuffPo in early 2005, 2006, when they first started, big blogger, obviously Arianna Huffington being a, very charismatic leader in that area. And so I had buddies that worked there at the time. And so, that was a really unique business model. That and, Gawker Media and a couple other things that kind of popped in around journalism, but they weren't historically journalistic, specific to rigor and fact checking and things like that. They were actually into articles that could possibly go viral. The headlines were really important. The engagement by enragement side of things took place. So, I mean, those were big business models that panned out, right? I mean, I think Armstrong paid $315 million for HuffPo in 2011 or 2012, like memory serves. But it was, in the business world, that was a big deal because these were, brand new by historical standards, publications that were reporting on the news. And to your point, they were not shy about where they leaned, right? It was very partisan, and they didn't give a shit about, you thought they were partisan. So that being said, did that have a long tail for you? When you started your own organization, did people start to look at your writings and say, hey, this guy's a complete liberal. He worked for HuffPo. I don't believe a word he says. He's completely biased. Did that follow you around a bit? Or
I mean, 100%. Like, in fact, to bring even more clarity to it, I mean, what happened for me was I left the Huffington Post to go start a new media company with Ashton Kutcher, the actor and VC investor, who at the time had just gone through this horrible episode where he had been dragged through the tabloids because he had basically walked in on a homicide, and he he was like the guy who called 911 discovering this, had this huge traumatic experience, and the press basically made like a 6-month story out of it. And, he was on like the front page of People and all these tabloids forever. And he had this very kind of like visceral reaction of like, the news sucks. I want to do something to fix it. Yeah. And he had this idea for like a really high-minded kind of upworthy news outlet. We call it, solutions journalism is like a school of journalism that's out there. Tina Rosenberg, who used to be at the New York Times, has done a bunch of workshops on it that I've been to. And it's basically like the idea is, let's focus our reporting on stuff that's actually working rather than the people who are breaking everything. Like, we don't have enough reporting on the people who are actually doing things that are working, having good outcomes for the country. So I left to go work at A+. I was the first, one of the first full-time editorial hires there. And we are a totally new brand. I mean, like, new logo, stuff nobody's ever seen before. Yeah. No, the only public facing thing is Ashton, who is like farm boy from Iowa with very mixed politics. He's like a big gun owner and kind of more libertarian than anything else. And I was writing reporting pieces and also doing some opinion pieces and running our columns and stuff. And we had a ton of exposure on Facebook because of him. And people would Google me, and it would be like, it didn't matter what I was writing about. It was getting dismissed and sort of downvoted and demeaned because they saw that I had bylines at Huffington Post, and they just made a ton of assumptions about what my worldview was. And, there's, at that time, I mean, I don't even know how I'd describe my politics then. I mean, I was writing sort of like populist political stuff. I mean, I was, smashing Hillary Clinton and talking about how Bernie Sanders would be like a transformative candidate for the party simply because he would bring the working class back, which honestly, in retrospect, I think was prescient in a lot of ways. But I wasn't like I wasn't like a party loyalist, and I wrote a ton of stuff also defending conservatives, saying that Trump was going to win in 2016. Saw some stuff I think some other people didn't because of my background, because of where I grew up. And
Bucks County, Bucks County alone will help you with that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in basically the most politically divided county in Pennsylvania, which is the most politically divided state in the country, and basically the most important state to every presidential election. And so I've got friends, family, coworkers from all across the political spectrum whom I love dearly for different reasons. And that's just the environment I grew up in. And it was eye-opening to realize how long that tail actually was. I mean, it took years, 5 or 6 years. I mean, today I never hear about it because I'm 3 years into this new project, but it happened for sure. And it took a while to shake it.
Yeah, you're about 175 weeks or something into your project. And so obviously you have plenty of homework to prove. And again, as someone who reads your work now, you're a good writer and you do good reporting. I wanted to share the Brittany Griner stuff because I thought it was such a well-reported piece, but it was a premium piece. I couldn't share it with
That's right. That's the trick, baby.
Yeah, that's the trick. So it was, I think that's really indicative of what Tangled is doing a really good job with, is that you are bringing an educational component to it, which is cool. And I would imagine, and I'm sure you have stories on this, because we did a piece on Ben Shapiro in February, and this was more along some media buddies of mine on my board because we were so impressed, right? This company came out of nowhere. He started it in 2015 with Jeremy Boring, and today it's doing $200 million a year in revenue. He's just killing it. And whether I don't agree with his politics, but I'm impressed with him as a business person. And I also don't think he's the Antichrist that most of my liberal friends believe. And so we wrote this piece, is Ben Shapiro the most powerful man in news media today? Got hammered. I got, unsubscribe, and you're platforming evil, and you're a terrible person, and how dare you? And I was like, all right. So we got just crushed on this. And so, like any good journalistic organization, we continue to dive in, on Daily Wire. We're going to do a couple of different pieces in early 2023. But I share that with you because I would assume that you get that level of venom too when you're writing pieces on specifically, and some of the homework I did on you guys, I think you have, and this may be old news, but 50,000 plus subscribers now, and a pretty balanced mix, 40% liberal, 40%, conservative, and then obviously the independents and moderates. Do you have the people on the fringe, the 8% on the far left, the 8% on the far right that just basically say exactly what I just said? Go fuck yourself. Terrible person.
Yeah. Look, okay, so there's sort of a few components to that. I mean, just as a point of clarity, the balance is more like 40% liberal, 25% conservative, and then 35% who refuse to identify or whatever, they're independent. So it's a little bit skewed to the left. I think the reason for that is not so much the content as it is that when I'm pitching this to people, you're much more likely to get an interested ear when you say I'm a journalist or reporter who started a politics newsletter, from people who are sort of center and to the left than you are center and to the right. I think for good reason, a lot of conservatives are just very untrustworthy of people with my background right now. And that's an obstacle I'm trying to climb over. I'm actually really happy with the balance of the audience we have. More importantly,
it's good.
Yeah. More importantly, the levels of trust we've surveyed our readers is identical, regardless of where they self-identify on the political spectrum, which is, to me, is like proof of the product and that it's working. So I get the venom for sure. Sometimes it's people who are like, it's their first day subscribing. They signed up for the newsletter. The next day they get their very first newsletter. And it's one of the newsletters that happens where I'm like, my take is a very strong take. Sometimes I come down pretty hard on one side or the other. And that can turn people off, in either direction. I defended Joe Rogan and Spotify when in the midst of that controversy. And I got tons of heat from people on the left who were just saying I was like platforming an anti-vaxxer and all this stuff, unsubscribing. Yeah, like a lot of, I literally got emails from people telling me that like by defending Joe Rogan, I was killing people.
Killing people. Yeah.
Immunocompromised people were going to die because of what I wrote, because I said I didn't think he should be kicked off Spotify. And then the opposite side of that is, I wrote about Florida's Don't Say Gay bill and basically said, I think it's really counterproductive and stupid for us to be demonizing trans people and gay teachers in school. And, nothing good has come out of this, pushing this bill through. Nothing good will come out of it. And, then I got the folks who are far on the right telling me I'm like a groomer and I must be a pedophile and how could I write this? So I run into that. I have one rule about how I handle that, which is it literally doesn't matter what people say, how angry they come at me. I will give every single one of those people one email where I am like my absolute best self. Like I will write them back and say, thank you for writing in. I hear what you're saying. I'm sorry that this, my take upset you or this content upset you. Here's how I think about this story. Maybe you misunderstood this part. I'd be curious what you think about this. I hope you keep reading. And, I'm really trying to build something that includes people like you in this. And I'd say like 50% of the time that I do that, I get an answer from somebody that's like, oh my God, I didn't think anybody was actually going to read this. Like, I'm sorry. I literally like they've been screaming into the void of the Facebook comment section for so long that actually getting bounce back to their feedback is like such a shocking experience. Or they're like, wow, you know what? I had a really emotional reaction to that. And I'm sorry, I appreciate you answering me. That's really cool that you wrote back. Here's what I actually think. And it's like way toned down. And then there's like a dialogue. And then the other half of the time they're like, no, fuck you, dude. Like, it's, I'm not interested in like your liberal woke trash.
Right.
So, but I'm like cutting that pile in half pretty regularly by just not taking the initial bait. And I think part of that's the platform. I think newsletters are really intimate. Emails are really intimate, one-to-one. There's nobody to perform for, no Twitter audience to get your likes for. It's just me and you having a conversation. Like you can either be a good person or not. And I think that helps a lot. And I also just think, again, people really they're not used to being heard right now in our current political moment. And a lot of people just want to be heard. They just want their perspective included. They just want to feel like somebody appreciates, why they're angry, what they're upset about, that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, we find the same thing. I have 3 media guys on my editorial board and 3 journalists. And so we come from that background, and we are convinced collectively that the divide out there is far more toxic online than it is in person. And the same kind of thing takes place. I got called a douchebag by someone for writing this article. I wrote an article on Hillbilly Elegy, and it said it was a piece that I published about J.D. Vance, and I said I liked Hillbilly Vance better. That was the name of the article. And this guy came after me and called me a douchebag. And I wrote a memoir years ago, was called The Life and Times of a Recovering Douchebag. So in my actual retort, I said to him, hey, I'm not a douchebag. I'm the douchebag. So let's just make sure we're clear on this. And I said, so, please just let me know what you disagreed with on the article. Because the article itself was, I admitted that I liked J.D. Vance. I thought that in 2016, he wrote his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which was well written and it was, heartfelt, and I thought it was just a good book. And he seemed like a good dude. And I'm I'm a left center guy. And so what I liked about him specifically was that I thought he was the up and coming Reagan Republican that a lot of the small C conservative friends of mine are looking for, myself included, because I think it's a much better balance for our body politic versus the Trumpers on that side. And so it was neat because after I wrote him back, he said, "Oh my God, dude, sorry. I was a little emotional that day." And he goes, "I loved your comeback. You now have a new subscriber." And so it's almost every time that I come back after someone hits me with some, ad hominem, it has proven to be very beneficial for, not only me, but for the organization itself at True 30. We get actual readership based on that. And I remember I was on the Daily Wire, because I spent a couple hours a week reading through their stuff because I like to see what's happening on the right. And I'm obviously very impressed with the organization as a media person. And I listened to a Sunday night talk with Ben Shapiro and Ron DeSantis. And it was a really polite interview, full of intellectual dissent. And obviously they agree with each other most of the time. But I actually commented because I'm an All Access member. And I said something effective, as a liberal, I'm not a huge fan of DeSantis and his antics, but this was a really good interview. Good job, Ben. I got 1,000 comments within 5-10 minutes, just, and it was, I thought, oh, here it comes. It's going to be brutal. And it was the opposite of what I anticipated. It was like, hey, it's really cool when a liberal admits they don't know everything. If you ever come to, Florida, I'll buy you a coffee. And it was just like tons and tons of this stuff. And I was like, wow. And I shared that with my editorial board just as an anecdotal example of, I don't think we're as hateful to each other if we, if you just admit, and I think you do a really good job of that too. You admit your bias to some degree. I think you've described yourself as politically incongruent, but it's one of those things where you may be a little more fluid there than I am, because I'm definitely left center, and I'll do the same thing. I'll point out, the right, and I'll go after Trump because I think he's just a lunatic, and I'll go after the sides that I think have just taken it too far. MTG is another example. And then on the left, I'll go after someone who, is misrepresenting words. That.
Yeah.
So I'm like, no, you just made that shit up, and that's just inaccurate, and you're hurting the cause. And so I hear you there. And so the next question for me to you is this. After 3 years of reporting as a publisher and as a journalist, how have your personal views changed? Have they shifted one way or another? They move more towards the center, more towards one way or the other? Because for me, I'll tell you, I'll share you my own personal views, but what has taken place with you as an intellectual? Because, you are reading 8-10 hours a day, every day, and writing. And when you read and write, you're activating different parts of your brain, and, you're kind of busting through these belief sequences and yeah,
for sure. So, first of all, I think it's been an incredibly transformative experience for me. I mean, I am way more knowledgeable, and I think I'm much more critical thinker now than I was 3 or 4 years ago. And that was after, 6 or 7 years of running a politics vertical at a news outlet that was getting tons of traffic and had, a staff and reporters under me and things like that. It has been like the most intellectually rigorous period of my life, for sure. Okay. Way more than college or my experience in Israel or my first few years in the business. Super challenging, so that's like just one definite piece of it. I sort of reject the premise of the question only in that I don't really believe there's like a left and right pole anymore. And I don't know. And this really truly isn't a cop-out. I mean, I had an interview actually that changed my mind about this with a guy named Hiram Lewis, who's writing a book about the myth of the left and right, who you would probably have a really good time chatting with. And he basically makes the historical case that like there is no left and there is no right. Like we have Republican and Democratic tribes, but 20 years ago, George W. Bush decided to invade Iraq, and everybody talked about how he was, lurching the Republican Party to the right. And 4 years ago, Donald Trump said, I'm pulling all our troops out of the Middle East, and everybody said he was lurching the party to the right. So what does it mean to be lurched to the right? I mean, it's just like, it changes based on, what we want the pejorative to indicate about whatever politician we're talking about. So I really do believe that, like, when people ask me, obviously I get asked a question about my political views all the time. And I just say, like, what issue are we talking about? Yeah. I can give you a few examples for sure, though. I mean, I think from writing Tangle, from interacting with a lot of people, my views on gun rights have become more conservative, much less like simple black and white. We need to like get every assault rifle off the street in the next 2 years. I've always actually kind of consider myself somebody who is like more pro gun rights than a lot of the liberals I knew. I grew up going to Texas with family who shot a lot. I learned to shoot a gun when I was 14. I actually really like guns. I think they're pretty fun. Not a fan of seeing them in cities like New York or Philadelphia where I live. But, you know, I understand why people like them. So like that's something that's, you know, I think my view on that has moderated a lot. I'm much more empathetic towards the kind of conservative, quote unquote, position on gun rights. On something like criminal justice reform, I've like gone even further to the left because I've encountered the arguments to my arguments so much, and they're so wholly unconvincing to me that like putting people in jail is good for society, that the police are doing productive work right now in our country. Like those kinds of things. It's like I feel really strongly that, you know, like compared to where I was 5 years ago, I've become a radical on the idea that locking a human being in a cage for 5 years actually doesn't make them a better person, doesn't help society, and doesn't teach them a lesson about whatever they did that was wrong. There are reasons to like isolate people from society. I believe that, but I've like yet to hear a convincing argument that jail does good things for us as a whole or for the person who it's happening to. Yeah. So like, that's like you know, those are examples that come to mind. Free speech and religious liberty, I've gone way right on in the last few years. I was always kind of right of center. You know, I spent time in Israel in a very religious atmosphere. I was learning at a yeshiva for 6 months, excuse me. I came home with like a much stronger compassion for like radical Orthodox religious people and why they viewed the world the way they did and what it meant to really live that life in an honest way. And I think we in America, and especially progressives in America, are really demeaning and dismissive of religious folks right now. And I think it's because like a lot of people on the left have a caricature of like, you know, the Christian who talks about Jesus, but doesn't actually go to church and just like invokes the Lord's name when they want to get something done politically. And increasingly for a lot of reasons as a Jew and what I'm seeing in our current climate also, I'm more and more convinced that like we need to really lean into ideas around religious freedom and protect religious liberty and the practice of religion, which, you know, I always thought like, America's so religious where, you know, it's such a kind of so rooted in religiosity that like we don't need to beat the drum of like protecting religious liberty. Like everybody who wants to practice Christianity can do it easily. I still think that's true to some degree, but I've like really had an awakening about, I think, how important it is, how valuable it is. The free speech stuff we've seen just in the last 4 or 5 years, I think is scary to me. It's coming from the left and the right. The left gets a lot of heat for, you know, censorship and things like that. The right's not particularly open to dissent right now either in a lot of ways. And, you know, they love to invoke free speech, but they don't practice it as well as they could. And, you know, so those are like, I guess, some things that come to mind that like have changed for me. And, you know, all the time I write, not all the time, but I'd say, you know, 5 or 6 times a year, I write a follow-up piece to a story I wrote because of the feedback I get from readers that the consistency of the feedback and the quality of it literally moves my position on an issue because it's just like, oh, you know what? Actually, I was wrong about that. And, people are so scared to do that. Every time I've done that in my newsletter, it's like, that's like when I get the best feedback from my readership is when I concede that, oh, I actually screwed up. I think my original take on this was maybe misleading. Here's what I heard. Here's why I think I'm changing my mind about it. And people aren't like, oh, you're a flip-flopper. You're like, oh, you're so gullible. They're like, wow, dude, this is so cool. I never see anybody do this, like admit that they're wrong about something and change their mind in real time. I still don't agree with you, but it was like super interesting to hear your thought process. And getting that positive reinforcement has made me more open to doing it, which has been a really cool experience for me.
Yeah. I mean, you have 75 corrections on your site as of this morning. I think I looked at it before we jumped on the call, but I like that about you as well. And you answered my question. It wasn't a cop-out. I think that your point, and by the way, I want to ping you later and see if I can get that guy on the show, talk about the left and the right.
Yeah, he's really interesting. I recommend it.
I agree with you on that because it's really hard to discern what does it mean to be a Democrat or Republican anymore because it's just all over the place. But you answered the question in the sense that you have changed your point of view. So he went further right on certain areas, gun control being one, and went certain left on other areas specific to criminal justice reform. I think that's an example of what I mean. And I think that, even reading some of your articles around Chesa Boudin, as someone who lives and works in San Francisco, I was like, I'd like to debate this guy on some of these things. And by the way, reformative justice is something I believe in because my little brother was in and out of jail and rehab and all of those things. So I have a personal place for it. And I actually interviewed Christina Soto DeBerry last week, who is the founder of Prosecutors Alliance. And she was the former chief of staff who hired Chesa Boudin and our current. And so I had a wonderful conversation with her about restorative justice. And I didn't debate her on my own personal opinions. I actually just wanted to get her take on things. And she, I think, kind of codified what was really important specific to that, which was, throwing people in prison and solitary confinement and things of that nature for a purely punitive reason doesn't work. And the recidivism rates are 70% after 10 years. So yeah, I'm with you on that. I did disagree with you on the Chesa Boudin piece, just because I've seen too much destruction here. I think he's gone a little too far with the progressive politics on that area, but we don't need to discuss that today.
Well, actually, what's fascinating about that is the Chesa Boudin piece was one of those pieces that I flip-flopped on.
I think you did. That's right.
Yeah, like I wrote a follow-up to my initial writing because I got
that. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I mean, I got like over 100 emails from readers of mine who lived in the Bay Area and were like, dude, like you're missing it. Like, this is what's happening on the ground. This is what it's like, and like half of them were people who were like, I voted for him and then I voted to recall him. And like, here's my perspective. And a lot of it was like, if you're looking at this from the national level, you're just trusting the FBI data and the police data that like none of this stuff's actually getting reported. So maybe on the numbers side, it doesn't look as bad, but like anybody who actually lives here and spends time here can tell you how the quality of life has changed. And it was like, there were just too many of those emails to be like, oh no, I'm like sitting here in New York and I totally know what's going on. I was like, oh shit, I missed this, I hadn't been to San Francisco in 5 or 6 years. And when I wrote the follow-up to that, sort of saying that I had gotten some of that wrong, the feedback was really positive. And like, again, even from people who still disagreed with where I landed, they were just happy to see that I was like being critical of myself,
No, I mean, that's definitely a piece that I enjoy about your work is that you admit it when you're wrong. I mean, Rachel Maddow is a little too left for me. I like her a lot. I respect her intellect. She also had something called misinformation in her day. So when she screwed up on a piece, she would actually put it up on a broadcast, say, I did this wrong. And I always loved that about her because she could admit when she was wrong, and you're doing the same thing. And I think that's really cool. So let's just back to journalism as a macro for a second. Have you read the book Bad News or heard about the book Bad News?
I have not read it, but I've heard of it. Yeah.
So Batya Ungar-Sargon, who is the editor-in-chief of Newsweek, wrote this book, and I was fascinated by it. And it specifically talked to the bias within our biggest news organizations, the August publishers of the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, all of the pieces, all of the things that I subscribe to. So I was like, okay, so, what in her, there's many things in her thesis, but the one thing she talked about that really jumped out was journalism itself. The journalists themselves have come from a very privileged place. And Barry Weiss talks about this a lot, based on her background. I'm sure you're versed in Barry, but it was one of those things where she said the journalists today have become influencers. And obviously you're not one of these. So I don't want to be clear to point that out. But if you look at Jonathan Swan and a couple other folks that have, big followings, and there was a memo that she surfaced in her book that talked in 2014 from the New York Times that said, hey, we want you to go out and get your own social graph, develop your own social following, be very active on social media and Twitter, and make sure you bring as many people to your articles as humanly possible. 91% of their demographic is Democratic, right? So they lean pretty heavily left. They've obviously been, the needle on the elections in 2016 was 98% voting for Hillary Clinton. So obviously they have some bias issues there. And she went, I think she did a very good job of kind of bringing these issues to the fore. But my long-winded question here is, what do you think? Did she hit any of these things with accuracy in the sense that a lot of journalists today are writing for a very specific demographic? Have they lost the true fight the power type, curiosity of old school shoe leather journalism? Is that something you see that's rampant, or you something you see as still fringe, and that journalism itself is still, on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to talk about this stuff, I think, in really broad terms, but
Yeah.
What I would say is, first of all, it's true that I think the profession is populated disproportionately by people who come from liberal, democratic, urban backgrounds. A lot of the people who get into journalism school are not coming there, transferring from a trade school or from rural America or whatever. It's just not as common. I went to the University of Pittsburgh. I was a nonfiction writing major. They did not have a J school there. They had like a journalism track. But Western Pennsylvania, really politically diverse place. There were very, very few obviously conservative people who were in my class at that time. I could spot them, and on campus at Pitt, as a whole, you ran into much more, conservative kids who are coming from Allegheny County, from the area around Pittsburgh. But it's just like, for all sorts of different reasons, I think it's not a particularly popular career path for people with more conservative backgrounds. So yes, I think that's definitely true. The audience stuff is really interesting. I mean, on the one hand, what I like to say about the way that those biases manifest themselves is, like, obviously you go read the New York Times and you read the Wall Street Journal and you read them covering the exact same event, and their stories look wildly different. Yeah. And that alone is evidence of, like, okay, there's something here that is amiss. There's a bridge here that needs to be built. And, for me, that was sort of that's very much part of the reason I started Tangle, was like, those are supposed to be the best journalists, editors, newsrooms in the world. They're the highest paid, the most qualified. They're the hardest jobs to get. And they are, in terms of the craft, they're the most well-trained. They have the most experience, but they're covering the exact same event. And the first quote's different. The sources are different. The angle of the story is different. The headline's different. So why is that? Like, the obvious answer is that those newsrooms are built collectively from the bottom up with different kinds of people with different political views, different worldviews. They network differently. First person in the door brings in their friend with them. They hire people who are studied with them at school or were at the same publication they were at before. And it just sort of snowballs. And once you have that, once the newsroom's insulated in that way, then obviously you want the audience to grow. You want people to subscribe. You want people to say you're doing great work. So if you're a New York Times reporter, pegging Donald Trump to the wall for financial crimes is a really good way to get subscriptions, right?
It really is.
Blowing up Hillary Clinton's campaign is not. That's just the reality of it. And I think reporters handle those motivations differently. Editors handle them differently. Newsroom executives handle them differently. I mean, you have to remember the pressures for, like, what to cover and how to cover it. They come from different levels. At the same time, though, I think the New York Times, which is obviously has the editorial board is obviously very left. And the story selection for even the news team, I think, is clearly left of center. They break news that is incredibly damaging to Democrats all the time. The New York Times did break the Hillary Clinton email story. That was their story. They were the first ones to be like, Hillary Clinton has a private email server and she's probably transmitting classified documents on it. I mean, that story sunk her political career. Yeah. She was like the darling of the party. They've done really, really scathing stuff on Barack Obama and the drone wars. I mean, it's not as if they never hit Democrats or don't do great journalism on other people, but there are obvious incentives, traffic wise and stuff to publish the kinds of pieces that are more unflattering to the right. So, it's a really hard balance. I don't think it's as simple as people think. Even if you're a reporter who's very liberal, if you see a Democrat doing something wrong, there's almost like more incentive and more disgust from that reporter in covering that kind of thing, because it's like, they believe this person's supposed to be on their team. They believe this person's supposed to be one of the good ones. And here they are being corrupt, doing something horrible. And they're like more motivated to write that really crushing, scathing investigatory piece that blows the whole thing up. I've seen that play out in real time. I've seen reporters who are writing about politicians that they used to really admire. And there's like so much frustration and angst there because of what they've uncovered in their reporting, that they are much more scathing in their coverage of them. So I don't think it's as simple as people think it is. I think it's absolutely true that like the media has, on the whole, in aggregate, at least in the traditional newsrooms, has a left-wing bent, and there's much more liberals who are working there. But the output of that can vary. And in today's world, the media as a whole is much more balanced than it's ever been because, sure, liberals still own, most of CBS and NBC, and the major network stations, I think, have more like a left of center tilt. And then you have Fox News, the most popular show on TV. But if you look at YouTube, if you look at Facebook, if you look at talk radio, podcasts, conservatives are dominating. So it's not as if it's an unfair fight by any means. So I certainly don't think that's an accurate assessment of where things are right now.
No, I mean, that's a great answer. I think that, for me, I would agree. There's 200 articles a day plus that go out from the New York Times. So I think that the majority of their pieces are, I think, done very well. I do believe specifically on multivariate testing, specific to headlines and things like that, where they know which ones, cater best to the engagement by enragement kind of thing. Anger was the number one mechanism in advertising that works. And so I give credit to her book for bringing that to the discussion, but I agree with you on that sense. I think the journalism itself is still doing yeoman's work out there. And obviously we have some bias to approach, which then leads me to my next question is, do you believe that your model, the subscription model, is the future of journalism? And I ask you that based on someone who I am a huge fan of, Bari Weiss, and her she's called The Free Press. It was Common Sense. She's recently rebranded. And she was interviewing Matt Taibbi and Bret Stephens about foreign policy. It was a fantastic debate. I love both of those journalists. And Bret Stephens is actually one of my favorite journalists of all time, and he's a conservative. But I really think he's a wonderful thinker. Much like you, he reports on what he finds. And he'll admit his own bias, but he's, I think, a stalwart reporter, and I really dig him. And he said something to the effect of, well, Bari, this is a shameless plug for you, but I think we need 10,000 more Bari Weisses out there to balance the media landscape. And I agreed with him immediately, not only because I'm in the space, but people like yourself who are actually reporting on news with an attempt at objectivity and nonpartisanship, and by bringing an educational component to your reporting. I think it's fantastic. Do you believe that subscription models themselves are the future of digital journalism?
I think they are the future of a healthy economic model for digital journalism, for sure. I don't know how they couldn't be a part of them. So, from my perspective, I'm watching what's happening right now in the media space where, we're seeing layoffs at Gannett, at CNN, at, basically every major media outlet there is, except for maybe the New York Times right now. There's been news in the last few weeks that either they're done hiring or they laid off, 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 workers or whatever. And in normal times for most of my career, a cycle like this, heading into the holidays, downturn in the economy, worries about a recession, is like every Friday you are like scared to check your email because layoffs are coming. And most reporters have gone through that. And I'm in a position now where it's like totally out of sight, out of mind to me. Like I have these subscribers I see every day, and it's like, unless, 8,000, 8,500 paying subscribers all magically decide to take the same action at the same time overnight and sync me, it's not going to happen. And it's like, it's way more stable. It's much more predictable. I'm making more money now personally than I ever did as a reporter. I'm starting to hire people and pay other people and all these things. So I think if you're putting out a really good product, it's really healthy. I'm actually starting to launch ads in the free version of the Tangle newsletter, which is not something I initially thought I was going to do. And mostly I'm doing that because people who are way smarter and more experienced and have more business savvy than I do have beat it into my head that having diverse revenue streams is a really smart thing to have.
It is,
as a long-term model. I mean, you'd be somebody who I'd love to pick your brain about, financially building what I'm doing right now. I'm a writer. I'm a reporter. I'm really good at talking to people. I'm really good at politics. I'm really good at writing. I don't know a fucking thing about running a business. So I am like, I've been learning on the fly, and like, I get invited to stuff now where it's like, because of Tangle's success, there's kind of like an entrepreneurial component to my career, that I'm like one of these people who's gone independent and succeeded. And I don't know. I mean, if I made some good business decisions along the way, it was probably lucky. I think the reason that I'm at where I'm at is because the content we're putting out is filling a need, and it's something people really want. And so to your point, I think it's the future for people who are filling that need, who are doing something that is missing. I don't think you could go start the New York Times right now and just do a straight subscription model and succeed. You'd have to find all sorts of different ways to make money the same way the New York Times does. The reason Barry's doing so well is because they're producing a lot of content that's hard to find in other places. I mean, they're publishing stuff that people aren't publishing in other places. She also came into it with her own following, I mean, she was a very controversial figure herself. So she got tons of free media just by creating it. I had like a little bit of a different path in that I didn't really have, when I started Tangle, I had like 10,000 followers on Twitter, which is something, I guess. But, I wasn't Barry Weiss. I wasn't publishing in the New York Times. I didn't have hundreds of thousands of people reading my stuff every day. It was Tangle that sort of popularized me in a lot of ways. So I've had a little bit of a different experience, but I love the subscription model. I think it's really, really awesome to see independent people succeeding. In some ways, I guess Barry's a competitor, but when I saw the Free Press relaunch and read about their numbers and the money they're doing, I mean, I was like pumped. It was, to me, that's just like proof that there is a need that, the traditional press isn't filling. That looks like an opening for me. I mean, as little as I know about business, I do know, competition is a sign that you are providing something that a lot of people want. And so it was really encouraging for me to see that she's building what she's building, because I hope to hire some people and expand our team a little bit long term. And it's clear it's a model that you can do that in. So yeah, I think it's going to be the future. I think more people like us are going to pop up and succeed and win. I couldn't do what I do without the traditional media, without the New York Times and the Washington Post and Fox News, who are doing a ton of this original reporting and giving me the columnists whose stuff I'm sort of speaking to and aggregating about and that sort of thing. But I think we are making it a more healthy and kind of diverse ecosystem. And I think that's a good thing for the country, for sure.
Well, I agree with that. And I think the actual subscription model itself works for us as well. We're brand new. We're about 8 months in, but that is how we plan on monetizing our future journalists and hiring more reporters and things of that nature too. So let's just say, again, I had you booked for 45 minutes. I'm way over that. So I appreciate your time. And I really am very impressed with you as an individual, and even more so with your platform. I think you do a great job of nonpartisan reporting. I love the idea of educating the audience specific to both sides of the story, because it is truly unique, and I haven't seen anyone else out there doing that. So I wish you nothing but continued success in 2023 and beyond, and keep doing what you're doing, Isaac, because it seems to be working, and our democracy and our citizens need it. So thanks a lot for what you're doing.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the time. And yeah, let's keep in touch. Maybe you can teach me how to run this freaking thing at some point. That'd be nice.
That I can do. Cheers,
All right, man.